And of course, changes in Chinese GDP is continuous, so this isn't really a before and after comparison. We're just comparing when Chinese GDP is a bit lower to when it's a bit higher. And what do we have? Well, the highlighted row is the regression coefficient we want to focus on. And you see we have a bunch of pretty standard controls. And we see that I won't discuss the controls because they don't really make a big difference to our estimates. The one thing to note is in addition to all the controls listed, we're also controlling for year fixed effects, to control for macro changes in the world over time and changes in these countries over time. That's shared by all sub-Saharan Africa. And we are also controlling for country fixed effects. So all time invariant differences across sub-Saharan African countries are being controlled for. And these are robust standard errors. What we see is that when China gets richer, the countries that have some oil export a lot more oil to China, right? This is not surprising. It's what people think is happening. Now let's look at what happens to the economic indicators. I never figured out how to get rid of these green things in Excel, so I apologize for this. Well, column 1 is just annual per capita GDP growth. And what we see is that when China grows, as China grows, the countries that have oil in sub-Saharan Africa, their per capita GDP also grows, quite a lot actually. And then this is all coming from growth in industry, like heavy industry, which is not surprising because they're just exporting oil. There's no effect on manufacturing. There's no spillovers in manufacturing. And also, there's no spillover, so it's not surprising that labor force participation rate isn't really improving very much. Of course, we need to take these data with some caveat. The quality is a bit dubious. There's no change in the share of military personnel. However, military expenditure is going up a lot as the Chinese economy grows for the sub-Saharan African countries with oil, right? So this is consistent with this fear that these governments are using their revenues from exporting oil to China to stay in power. Basically, they're getting more guns because they're not getting more soldiers or better guns. Well, what happens, so is this really bad for the country in terms of institutional development? With all the caveats that go into these data, we took every single indicator that's available today to researchers on institutional development and human rights, and we find nothing. These countries aren't doing better, they're not doing worse. The coefficients are tiny, they're insignificant, and interestingly, there's some evidence that human rights is actually getting better. So there's fewer human rights atrocities. So if we look at, regardless of what human rights indicator we look at, they're negative, and some of them are positive, are statistically significant. Sorry, they're statistically significant, but always negative in magnitude. So what does this really mean? Well, it means that the speculations seem to be correct. Of course, that Chinese growth is fueling, no pun intended, it's fueling oil exports to China from sub-Saharan African countries. This is increasing short-run GDP, as you expect it to. It's increasing short-run GDP growth. All of it is being driven by the oil sector. There's no spillover to the rest of the economy. And we see an increase in military expenditures to confirm this idea that governments are using this money to stay in power. Well, but institutions aren't getting worse, and human rights are getting better. There's suggestive evidence that human rights are getting better. So this is good and it's bad. The good news is that the countries aren't getting worse. The bad news is we don't really want to overinterpret the fact that human rights might be getting better. It could be that human rights are getting better because the dictator in charge has bigger guns, right? I mean, if their guns are just so big that they can just win, then there's going to be less conflict. There's going to be less civil conflict in general. I mean, you're not going to fight if you know you're going to die for sure. And we know that conflict is correlated with human rights atrocities. So this is good news and bad news. It's a bit ambiguous. So I'll conclude here. So I think that there is a lot we can learn from the Chinese experience. But what I think what is very important is before formulating policy or theories of what we can learn, we need to establish facts and dispel myths. We don't want to just go on speculations. And I mean, as I've shown, some of these speculations are right on, and others are wrong. And I focus only on 3 facts. I mean, there's a lot of things one could talk about, but we've only talked about 3. One is that the Chinese economy isn't private, at least not yet. It's nowhere close to being private. If you compare the equity ownership by the state to any Western economy or Japan, you know, what we think of a market private economy, it's far, far away from being that. It's reasonably close to Russia. The second fact is that there is democracy in China. It's extremely limited, but it's not purely cosmetic. So at the local level, it's doing a lot of what democracy should be doing. But what's unclear is what the central government is going to do with this. Is this helping central governments be better autocrats or to stay autocratic? Or is this going to lead to more democracy in China? That's unclear. And the third is that there's no evidence that the Chinese economic growth is making Africa worse by importing vast amounts of natural resources from Africa. However, this is not at all saying that changes can't make things better. Like, this isn't to say that if China had a different economic policy, that it can't make things better in the countries that it's doing business with in sub-Saharan Africa. We don't have any evidence to say that's true or not true. So I thought I would end, since this is a junior keynote speech, and all of my studies are still ongoing, and lots of you are doing ongoing research, I thought I would end on some things to do for the future. So there's tons to do. And so this is just kind of, brushing over the surface. So I think one really interesting question is to ask, is state control of the private sector a way of avoiding mass asset stealing, like what happened in Russia in the early 90s? Like, is it a good thing or a bad thing, right? Or is it, we can come up with more cynical hypotheses. Second is economic growth delaying democracy in China? So traditionally we have this idea that economic growth leads to the rise of the middle class, which leads to a demand for enfranchisement and democracy overall. However, one could think that economic growth also allows autocrats to stay in power because they're basically able to bribe the population by just giving them stuff, like public goods or roads or things that make them better off, but also allow the autocrats to stay in power. And then a third question, which I think is really fascinating and comes up a lot if you read about what's going on in China today, is about media freedom. Like, what are the trade-offs for media freedom in China? Like, on the one hand, the government wants to control the media so it can control information to the people. On the other hand, a lot of people think that having certain amounts of freedom for the media is good for the government because the media essentially is just another monitoring device. It can monitor for local corruption and regional corruption,